Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and I'm really excited to have a panel of clinicians on today to talk about the reversal of the changes in policy that we saw announced yesterday by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormon Church. So we're going to talk about that. I'll explain a few things about that here in a minute. But before we get started, I would just like to give a shout out to all of you who help make this podcast possible by contributing with a donation, whether that's a monthly subscription type of donation or whether you offer kind of donations here and there when you can. This podcast completely depends on listener sponsorship. So I would just really ask, if you find this podcast to be of value to you, that you'd be willing to place a value of that in a financial way and offer a donation, which you can do very easily at mormonmentalhealth.org. There's a nice little donation button, makes it very easy for you. If we had, everybody who listens just donate $1 a month, we would have no problems keeping this sustainable. So it doesn't take much. If you can offer more than $1 a month, great. I'm not going to detract from that, but it can be really small and you can still make a significant difference. Other ways that you can support our podcast are to like the Facebook page, share any podcast materials with other people through social media. So, share this interview, for example, or if you're listening on iTunes, you can share those things as well. You can also leave us a review, a positive review on either Facebook or iTunes. That makes a big difference as far as how many people we get to listen and things of that nature. I really believe in the purpose and mission of this podcast. I think it's a wonderful resource. I love creating the interviews. I think the people that come on are just amazing and have so much to offer us as a community. And so I would hope that you would be willing to support. Oh, and then just personally, if you want to know anything that I'm doing, you can find me on natashaparker.org. So whether that's retreats or workshops or clinical practice, my online practice, which is Symmetry Solutions, you can find on there. Whatever else you might want to reach out to me for, you can find on my personal website. All right, so moving on, I just wanted to kind of just state a few things. First of all, this is not a panel discussion. I'm a big believer that if you have a panel discussion, that you should have people who are part of the community that you're talking about. Today, we're going to be talking in particular about the LGBTQ plus community and how they've been impacted by the policy changes back in 2015 and now here in 2019. So we are coming at this interview from a purely clinical perspective. So whether or not any of us identify as LGBTQ plus is not really the emphasis here. We're going to talk more about this from how we see it as people who are involved in the community, serve as mental health professionals, and what that's like. Our goals are really kind of threefold. We're going to start kind of from a vulnerable perspective. So all of the people on the panel today are actually providers at my online practice, Symmetry Solutions. I'm going to have them introduce themselves here in a minute. They are all people who have worked within this population. And we were having a provider meeting earlier today that we usually have, a weekly meeting. And we got very vulnerable with one another about how this affects us as service providers in the world of Mormonism. And Sara made a really great point that we don't create a lot of spaces sometimes for those who are just serving the communities. And we don't oftentimes role model in great ways how those of us who are serving have also been affected and changed through all of these experiences. So we're going to do that first. That's going to be kind of the first thing that we do, is just kind of role model a little bit of how this has affected us from the service provider framework. We know that there's a lot of other mental health providers out there, members of the Mormon Mental Health Association, people who work in, places like N-Circle or other LGBT groups, people who are supporting, groups at schools, all kinds of things. And these are tender moments for all of us as well. Our number 2 goal is just to kind of talk a little bit from a clinical perspective about what might be some of the normal feelings that are kind of all over the place for the general population in Mormonism right now. And number 3 is we're going to talk about maybe offering some strategies for General Conference coming up, because again, as clinicians, we tend to know that General Conference can be a tender time for a lot of people. It doesn't always have positive ramifications, and people show up with their anxieties, fears, sadnesses in our offices after General Conference. And now we have kind of a double doozy, right? So we've had a big shift in our church, and then we're going into it, General Conference, just a day and a half later. So that's our goal for today. I'd like to welcome our panelists. So if we can just go around, maybe Sara, then Jen, then Lisa, if you can just kind of quickly introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you, Natasha. My name is Sara Hughes-Zabawa. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I received a dual master's degree from the University of Michigan in interpersonal practice and mental health, as well as interpersonal practice and community and social systems, with a minor in community organizing, and also received a graduate certificate in women's studies, where I focus on the intersection between women's mental health and women's spirituality. So lots of school. And yet at the same time, I join you as a provider who has been incredibly influenced and dramatically changed as both a person and a professional, as I've witnessed the consequences of the November 5th policy on my clients and on the community in which I love. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sara. Jen.
I'm Jennifer White, and I'm a therapist. I specialize in working with people with depression, anxiety, as well as domestic violence and substance abuse. And I have experience doing couple work and issues around sexuality, and been doing a lot of work with people that are dealing with a faith crisis or a faith transition.
Thank you, Jen. Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Butterworth. I am a mental health counselor in Boise, Idaho. I have a degree in mental health counseling. I'm also the founder of Feminist Mormon Housewives, which is a community that many people may have heard of or may have participated in. And I also I can't remember how Sara put it, but it sounded so good, but basically lots of feelings. And that's an interesting challenge when you have a lot of personal feelings and then you have clients, and how to balance processing how this is arriving from me and my spirit and in my body, and then how to hold space for my clients when they come to me in really vulnerable, difficult situations because of these changes.
Thank you. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Sara, a little bit, but you were the one that brought this up in provider meeting.
Absolutely.
And you had some really beautiful language about just kind of the impact of sitting with people from 2015 on, and just an invitation for you to share a little bit personally what that's been like for you.
Absolutely. And Natasha, honoring the purpose of the Mormon Mental Health podcast, I know other clinicians listen here. And I wish there was more candidacy and honesty in our conversations as clinicians with each other and with the public, that what we witness changes us, right? That is not a deficit in our qualities as a provider or in our boundaries. But I think when you witness systemic abuse and or great trauma within a community, which I think many of us have within the LGBTQ space, honoring their families, honoring their loved ones and their partners in this last 3.5 years, I want to cultivate the vulnerability to say, how are we doing? Right? I think so oftentimes we go into crisis mode, right? We are trained for that. We are trained to hold space for clients and their families. And I wish both the general public recognized that when big moments happen, cultural shifts happen within religious experiences or religious spaces, like, and this isn't unique to Mormonism, it dramatically impacts our clients, right? It dramatically impacts what we see. I think many therapists who work within the Mormon spectrum of belief or within Mormon LGBTQ youth and young adults and adults recognize that we gear up for General Conference. Right? I think many people don't even recognize the reality of the spaces we hold. And I am not saying that that is a burden. I am not saying that that energy or witnessing is greater than the individuals who are suffering. I want to make sure that we don't minimize their experiences or their story, but I think as clinicians, we need to talk about it. And for me personally, the November policy dramatically changed my life and who I am as a clinician and who am I as a person. And to be more specific, I had a small practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when the policy came out. And what ended up showing up in my office was a wave of LGBTQ young adults and children and youth that were predominantly closeted. And so what ended up happening is how families were talking about the November policy, these closeted youth were hearing it. And so I'm getting phone calls from parents all over saying, Sara, my teenager really showing signs of depression. Can they come in? Sara, I think they might be a little bit anxious, like something's shifting, right? And what ended up happening is in front of me were our closeted Mormon youth, right, who were terrified of coming out to their parents with their acknowledgement of how their families were speaking about LGBTQ individuals, not recognizing they were talking about their child. And so for me as a clinician, that launched me into a journey of finding all of the very best resources for LGBTQ youth, both from a faith affirming and individual affirming sources, right? Like one of my favorite is the Family Acceptance Project. We utilize that within both church leadership and ward communities and within families. And and for the last 3.5 years, I think for many of us, it has been a war zone. And we've been battling to keep kids alive and to keep people alive. And so for individuals who are celebrating the shift in the policy, I think for many of us who've witnessed the irreversible damage and the lives that we can never reclaim and the families that have been destroyed, it creates our own feelings as clinicians, right? We can't not be moved by what we've witnessed. And I just want to make sure that we create a space within the provider community that we can talk about it, that we can name it, and once again, help our clients feel heard and honor the witnessing. It's a privilege to witness, right? And at the same time, there's a responsibility to speak out.
Tony Hughes says, yes, I am listening and learning. Thank you for leading these conversations and your contributions. If you're listening, please feel free to leave comments, questions, your own perspectives about these issues. We'd love to include you in our conversation. Sara, thank you for that. Are you comfortable sharing a little bit about what yesterday was like for you from a clinical perspective?
Yeah, so phone calls and text messages started showing up immediately in the morning. As someone who, my specialty is trauma, and what we saw was vicarious trauma, right? So individuals who the reconversation of this, the gaslighting of the experience, I think Natasha, you did a beautiful job in the conversation yesterday about explaining what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is the conversation of your emotions, what you're feeling are not real. Right? So individuals having this huge reversal, and what we'll talk about later is the complex emotions that show up. That is both PTSD and can also mimic signs and symptoms of grief, right? So what I saw was relief, was confusion, was disbelief. I saw, parents reaching out saying, I was so wrong. I was so wrong, right? Utilizing the narrative of a revelation to justify some really cruel behavior towards their LGBTQ children. So I also saw full circle moments, right, where there was invitations for apology. There's invitations for repairing and healing within families. I also saw parents who lost children in the 3.5 years that say, really feeling the sensation of this doesn't change anything. The honoring of the reversal, that the reversal and the change does not shift the irreversible damage. Right? And also a lot of fear from other parents of a narrative shift from apostate to a serious transgression that does not keep our LGBTQ youth safe. Tell me how that reduced risks. So also fear from family members and parents who are saying, I'm worried what this is going to mean for Jimmy or Sally, right? Like the fear of what is this going to trigger in my youth? We were just in a better place, right? So, I saw the whole gamut. And once again, as clinicians, we kind of know what's going to show up, right? Like I think other people can just read the news and shut that off. That's when the crisis shows up.
Are you comfortable? I feel a lot of emotion in your voice. Mm-hmm. Are you comfortable sharing some of your own personal process, emotion through this from a personal voice?
I think for many of us, we have that clinical ability to shut off. That's not true. That's not real. I'm going to take that back. We have the ability to show up in ways that our clients need us to, right? So when I'm in that space, it's not about me. And yet when I shut off that phone at night and I sit in with myself, what shows up for me is deep grief, deep, deep grief. And at the same time, the acknowledgement of how much pain and suffering I've witnessed. And to see people be able to move so quickly through in a form of celebration and not have witnessed what I have, and to also continue to witness our LGBTQ Mormons really struggling and really in pain, and the reality that this changes very little regarding the safety of our youth and the safety of our LGBTQ members, like that remains devastating. It remains devastating. And so I'm having to navigate my own emotions about this and thinking about self-care and thinking about support for me. And I think as clinicians, we have the ability to ask ourselves, are we taking good care of ourselves? Because we matter too. We matter too.
Thank you for that. I'm a big proponent of challenging some of these, I think, basic narratives that we have in mental health land of, clinicians should be blank slates and should be always, very clinical in their approaches. And I think that we know through the research that we do the best work when we join with our clients, and joining is an interesting emotional process. So we can't divorce our emotions from the clinical process very much. And I think the more honest we are about that, the better off we are, the better off our clients are, and the better off our communities are. Because, the thing that I think about the most as I hear you speak, and I used this term in my speech when we were talking about protecting the LDS children from worthiness interviews, I start off by saying, I have authority to say what I'm going to say. And authority is a big word in Mormon culture. And we see authority as primarily coming from priesthood keys, which is fairly male driven in our church and has certain meaning. But the authority that you're talking about here is lived authority. We have authority from a clinical perspective. We have authority from the educational process we've all been through, which has been profound. And we have authority in what we have lived through in the spaces of our very sacred, private, confidential rooms where people can really be who they are, which is very different than what shows up in a bishop's office, which is very different than what shows up in a family sofa. And so we come from a space of very profound authority. And I want to be clear too, as we continue this conversation, that all of us have deep regard and love for our Mormon community. So when we challenge and when we say things are abusive and when we say things need to change, we are not coming at this from an anti perspective or a burn the whole house down perspective. No, we are very devoted and, I would say, invested in the well-being of our people. And that's the space we come from. So those are some of the thoughts that came to me as I heard you talk.
Thank you, Natasha.
All right, Jennifer, any thoughts you want to share as far as just your own personal journey as a clinician from 2015 to now, what you're witnessing now?
I'm definitely seeing a lot of the same things that Sara brought up. One of the things about having this opportunity to do this work is you do witness and you do see so many different emotions, and how a policy change can really deeply affect, each of the members, and sometimes we kind of minimize that, but that's very real. I mean, I remember how just the reaction in 2015, and when you see so many people, become and having suicidal thoughts over these issues, you can't help but, really step back and really want to see how you can help and be there. And it does change your perspective, on different things if you're really trying to join with your clients and understand where they're coming from. And I think that's something that's very valuable, that's what makes therapy effective. And so yeah, it's been a hard these years, and with this policy and trying to understand and loving, growing up, I do have so much love for my church, but I have so much love for my LGBTQ brothers and sisters and how this has affected them, and very much want to advocate and do my best to help.
So, and not to put you on the spot either, but both you now and Sara have talked about how this process forces us to change our own perspectives. And I think that what we're really talking about there is that it changes our relationship with our own faith journey, right? With our own ideas about being Mormon, being spiritual, being, a person who, I guess, goes forward with righteous intent and righteous belief, right? And a lot of times how I see this in general kind of religious communities, whenever you have issues that are values driven, it's like, well, sorry, but that's kind of what God said. And so what are we supposed to do? Like, we love you, but this is how kind of God wants us to go forward. And so a lot of the thinking or the processing is kind of not really entered into because, well, it's the God trump card, right, is what I call. So are you able to just briefly talk about maybe your own faith journey? How comfortable are you just talking about how, when you say change of values or change of perspective, what does that really mean for you?
There's definitely things that I probably wouldn't have questioned if I wasn't doing this work in my own faith. Because I'm really trying to have empathy and really see where my clients are coming from. And, that's such a great quality, empathy. But it requires a lot of work and me doing my own work. And so it's definitely required me to, practice my own work and make sure that I'm kind of figuring out how I view things. In some ways, it's given me more room to have that space for myself, to have my own emotions and my own thoughts around these issues. Whereas, before I might have just disregarded them as I'm making opportunities for my clients to have that. And so, yeah, in a very real way, there's a lot of things in my faith that I've questioned that maybe I wouldn't have if I didn't see all this hurt and harm. And that is something that I think we need to share, because as we witness this, we need to share with how much harm is being done, because people often just don't know how many people are suffering. And if they knew, I think that I really have a hope that they would want to help, and
Yeah.
they would care.
No, I love what you said there. And I think that part of maybe sometimes what we don't talk about from a clinical perspective, and I've seen this in other religious circles as well, is going into this type of work, you can't but be challenged in how you see your spirituality, how you see your values. You have to make room for other people's ideas and values. That's basic bias check, 101 that we're all trained in. And so I think, and it's interesting too, as I've become more of a supervisor and offering more consultation to actual mental health providers instead of just only doing clinical work with the public, I've seen a big influx in my practice of other mental health professionals contacting me about their own faith journeys, their own faith transitions, their own kind of values work, and how that impacts their work as clinicians. So I think we can't help but be impacted if you're going to go into this work. So thank you for sharing those thoughts, Jen. Yes, Sarah.
And once again, Natasha, I think that needs to be, as clinicians listening to this, it is not a deficit in your experience or your clinical skill set to be moved and to question, especially as it relates to values or religious affiliation. Like, I think oftentimes there's a narrative of that there is something wrong. And I really just want to push back on that. I think the reality is I know very few clinicians who haven't been moved or challenged or having to do some deep questioning and reflection work because of what they've witnessed. And I think that is beautiful and not a deficit.
Yeah, and like Jen just said, she can see, wow, this is an opportunity to step into spaces I probably wouldn't have even considered, if I hadn't been kind of in that space to do so. And it's also where I come off when I say things like, I'm probably, the least orthoprax or ortho believing ever in my life, and yet I feel more Mormon than ever. So isn't that an interesting paradox, and just how I see my own spirituality and journey within my faith structure? Because maybe the conformist way or the ideas of how I should fit in, I really don't fit in those ways anymore, but yet I feel more identified than ever. So interesting way that I think about it. Lisa, tell us kind of your process through yesterday and kind of your own personal thoughts and journeys as you're looking at this from your role as a clinician, but also as a person.
Yeah, yesterday obviously kind of took me back to 3.5 years ago. How long was it?
3.5.
And yeah, I had kind of an interesting experience where I was in a professional space the day after I was at an LGBTQ training, the day after the policy was announced. And I was a mess. I was crying. In fact, one of the things that was interesting to me is that I cried so much in that time period that my eyes got chapped. I've never done that before, where like my eyes, like the constant tears coming out of my face made my eyes go all red, and I had to get special ointment. Anyway, so I was a hot mess, and I was at this LDS, and there was another LDS woman in this space who was a new professional and who seemed to be quite orthodox. And the teacher in the space asked me to kind of share what had happened and my response to it. And the other LDS provider started sharing her perspective that was kind of party line perspective. And I actually got quite angry, and I told her to shut up. And I was just thinking about that and how I've sort of carried some shame for sort of not being professional in that space, because it was a professional space, but I was so emotional that I just didn't have space to hold somebody else's opinion in that moment. And I don't know that I have any answers to how I responded or how I wish I would have responded differently, but just thinking through that, I guess my hope is that I don't know, but just kind of contemplating in our professional spaces how we respond to each other when we have these differences of opinions, or when these highly emotional charged situations come up. And like wondering if I was in a professional situation today with people who disagreed with me, would I be able to be more professional and not get angry? Or, like, I don't know. it's so hard to sort of be professional when the feelings are so big. And I seem to be able to do it better with my own clients. Like it's like this different mindset. You know, if I have an Orthodox client who comes in and expresses these opinions, it's like I have this meeting them where they are. But when it's other professionals, it feels more vulnerable or more threatening or something, where it's harder for me to take a step away from it and just meet them where they're at. And it's more personal. I don't know that I don't necessarily have a narrative.
I'm not sure that we owe other professionals the same filter that we owe clients. In fact, I think that, although I have a mixed feeling about that, right? Because on the one hand, I think the professional world in mental health can be quite brutal. Like, we're quite judgy of each other. And it can be very hard to be vulnerable because everybody's kind of always checking, well, are you doing good work? And are you being ethical? And are you damaging your client? And so sometimes there's a culture of silence within mental health professional workshops and associations and conferences I've been to, where I've even felt intimidated to raise my hand and have a differing opinion. And at the same time, yeah, we need to call each other out, you know, especially when there's problematic bias and that could be projected onto clients and that could actually cause harm. So that's an interesting dilemma just within the field. And I can understand your processing of that. Although I think some righteous anger is okay. That, you know, we can talk maybe not necessarily today, but how do we do that in professional ways and yet still call people out on their bias that could be really harmful? Sara, you had a comment?
I mean, I just really appreciate Lisa's honesty that there can be real conflict within the professional space about what these changes and what these things mean, right? For the individual and for the community. And yet at the same time, I think there's such a beautiful invitation of how are we being each other's champions as providers, right? Like, I have received so much support from other clinicians in sharing resources, in doing check-ins, right? Like, I think many of us, like this morning in our meeting, we're able to be like, hey, how's everyone doing? Right? And so it's that invitation of, yes, where are our boundaries? And I think, Lisa, what showed up for you is how that individual discussed was a violation of your boundary and your authority, like Natasha said, about what you were witnessing and what you were personally experiencing. And yet at the same time, I think for the listeners, like, how are we championing each other? And at the same time, it requires vulnerability to reach out to another clinician and say, like, this is rocking my life. You know, like, how are you doing? Like, how are you making sense of this? What resources are you finding beneficial for you as an individual and for your clients? Like, I'm hoping that we can create more community regarding the reality of that providers, we need each other.
Yeah, and you know, I think that ideally that is the space I would want to be in. And I also feel like part of my process in the intervening years has just been to recognize that I'm human too, and that I'm not always going to walk into the space being the provider or the support, or that I would hope that I could be in other circumstances. And sometimes I'm just vulnerable and wounded myself. And then that's a good sign that I need to go to my own therapist and get some work done, right? And that was actually what I ended up doing. I'm like, okay, I think I need to go to get to my therapist and work through some of this before it starts coming out in ways that are not healthy with my clients or with my family or with other people in my life.
I love that. Well, thank you. Yeah. Agenda, do you have a comment?
Oh yeah, just to normalize, like, of course, the day after finding out about this policy and being in a training like that, to normalize the anger and the crying, and that's just where we are human. And that there needs to be a space for that, for us not to be perfect and to show real emotion. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's good role modeling in your dysfunction, Lisa. Woohoo, good job. All right, so we have two comments that will help us kind of move into the second part of our interview, which I think are really important, and I really appreciate these comments. So Isaac Matthews says, The first presidency and 12 apostles of the LDS Church owe millions of people an apology. There needs to be accountability and sincere reconciliation in this situation. We must expect no less from a group of men who teach people how to repent, which includes saying you are truly sorry when you cause harm on others. Speaking in the name of God comes with responsibility and consequences. This is no joke. So that's a comment on apologies. And then the next one that I think, is kind of on the same lines that we'll be talking about, Marshall Bircher says, how are y'all addressing the very clear cycle of abuse the organization is doing? I keep seeing people denying the factor. This is very serious. People take their lives because of this. So I really want to approach these two issues because, and this is where it gets tricky, I think, for us, because we want to remain advocates of Mormonism and the Mormon community, and we are going to be calling out that this is an abusive cycle. And sometimes it can be hard in a community like ours to hold those two realities in the same space. How can you be supportive and loving and, advocates and competent in working within a population when you're saying that we are acting in abusive ways? So I believe that's very possible, and that's what we're going to kind of head into now. So any thoughts, first of all, about trauma work, apologies, how they fit into that, or maybe even if somebody wants to start out with just talking about what an abuse cycle looks like. So Sara, you had your hands up, and Jen, I know you work with domestic violence issues as well, so I'd like to hear some thoughts from you on the cycle of abuse.
I'd love to give Jen that opportunity, especially with her expertise. And I think the comment about an apology is an example of what we're seeing. The needs surrounding this for the community are different. Some people are when they think about their own repair work and healing the trauma, an apology is essential and important part of them. And I know, Natasha, you spoke yesterday that in the majority of repair work, if not all repair work, sincere apology is actually a really important part, right? And so I just want to know if you're experiencing that need and that accountability, that is healthy. That was what I think many people would accept or expect, right? I think the acknowledgement of damage that is irreversible is essential, I think, for many. And I think, once again, how do you navigate that knowing that that is likely not going to happen? I'm always going to create hope and space that it would. But what you're recognizing in that is a boundary is being violated, right? The lack of an apology is not fully repaired. And, Natasha, I would like you to just take a moment and be able to speak to that reparative work.
Well, and I think, I think apologies are interesting because by no means, it's not like if an apology was attached to this, that all would be well, right? And that somehow that creates, the magical, ideal space. At the same time, like you said, Sara, we know that apologies do create or help create a more fertile soil for healing. Because what apologies offer, especially sincere, well-done apologies where you don't justify or excuse or somehow minimize, when you really say, I'm sorry, I recognize I've done harm and I take responsibility for my part in that. When that type of an apology is offered, what it does create is a space where, first of all, there is validation for the victim. So the person doesn't feel like they're crazy anymore, right? Like that gaslighting stuff does to people. It's like, yes, there is a reason here why I'm hurting. There is a reason why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. And secondly, it offers that accountability. So it's kind of like this justice piece that there will never be full justice, but apologies help at least create part of that scenario. And I call it one of the many puzzles in a healing scenario, one of the many pieces of the puzzle. So it's not the full puzzle. It's not going to create wonderful, healing and completely take care of the issue. But when you don't have an apology, there will always be a missing part of the puzzle. There can still be a lot of healing done individually by people, and people do it all the time. People are resilient because there are many perpetrators, many people who abuse, many people or entities that hurt that never do offer apologies. I would hope from the bottom of my heart that our church wouldn't be one of those things, one of those types of entities. Right now it is being one of those types of entities. But I would encourage people to understand the role of apology, why it's important, and why the church, and I would agree with Isaac, who says this is part of the process that is necessary for us as a community to heal. And so I would call upon the leaders of our church to offer that, because we know through our authority as clinicians who deal with trauma that it is helpful. It is an important piece of the puzzle. That's what I would say.
Can I just add really quick that even if you're not a leader of the church, like you as an individual with family members or friends that you may have harmed through your opinions or things that you have shared that you might regret, I think it's always worthwhile to reach out and apologize for ways that you may have hurt people, and recognizing that that's a really vulnerable thing to do, to look back and say, I was wrong and I'm sorry. And that it doesn't necessarily, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard is because it feels like maybe we are saying that I'm a bad person, right? I'm a bad, and we are all kind of victims of the system. I had to unlearn a lot of things that I learned in the system, and I continue to have to unlearn things that I learned in the system, and I continue to do damage. And the more that we can awaken to the damage that we're doing and apologize for it, the more that we help our vulnerable brothers and sisters to heal, and also the more we become the people we want to be.
Thank you. No, I totally agree with that. There's a lot of power in the, overall community. There's a lot of power in the small part of the community. So each family, and Sara, you mentioned that you had that experience yesterday with some clients that spoke with you about their kind of that process of, stepping into that space of remorse and sadness and accountability.
Yeah, and once again, I think a lack of apology is a missing of that puzzle piece is trust. So many people's trust was broken, either with the institution, with church, their challenge their relationship with their trust with a higher power, and so I think the accountability so many people are seeking are also do some repair work around trust. And I would also invite individuals to start looking and trusting themselves and their own intuition in this too. And I loved your invitation, Lisa. So many people, family members, utilize language from the first policy, particularly around revelation, that deeply wounded individuals who are either speaking out, that might have been many of us, as well as their family members who were in marriages that they could use the word and term apostate regarding. And yet what I saw, the invitation with yesterday with the reversal, where family members could poignantly see they were wrong, right, in their interpretation of the experience. And so their ability to circle back and also recognize that their family member might not be able to receive that apology yet, because an apology might not be enough. And so there's permission there too, that yes, we need to practice owning where we have done harm. And that can be as simple as an email, a phone call, text message of like, hey, I know I pushed back really hard on you standing up against this because you knew that there would be pain, or you knew this would in fact impact a loved one. I'm really sorry, right? Like we can practice and model that. And I think where the institution is failing in this moment with an apology, can we as a community show up for each other and be the people we need from each other?
Marshall says, I really appreciate this discussion about repair and trust. So thank you. It's an important discussion to have. And I agree with you, Sara. I don't think an apology really is ever enough. It's just, like I said, a piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece, and it can really propel healing in a much quicker and more effective way. And that's why it's so important. Jen,
I just want to say that I also love what Sara said about we have to also remove an expectation from that apology that it can or will be accepted the way we want it to be, right? That if we've done damage and we reach out and apologize and the person isn't ready or willing to receive that apology in the way we think they ought to, that's part of the damage, and that's part of accepting that we were part of the damage, and expecting them to, give us a cookie for an apology is not truly repentant, if we're going to use church language, right? Like when we've truly repented of the damage we've done, we accept that they get as much time as they need in the world to heal their wounds and process, and they may never be able to sort of accept the apology in the way we would hope.
Which really gets to a lot of what we're seeing in the comments of just kind of the general community, right? So you see a lot of people saying things like, well, this is wonderful, this is great, why aren't you happy? Isn't this what you wanted, right? And so that kind of speaks to that idea that, yes, even though this is definitely a necessary step, this had to happen. It's not necessarily progress in the sense of what we would hope, or healing in the way that we would hope. And it's just getting us back to a starting point. We talked a little bit about this in the provider meeting. We started off in a bad place to begin with. Then, in 2015, we took about like 500 steps in a very much more harmful way, which we are now just getting back to that starting point, except for now, we're not really at that starting point. We're still not at it because we have all this carnage and sadness and hurt and pain that step to begin with took. So is it really progress? This is kind of where the abuse cycle stuff that I want Jen to talk about is important, because we don't say, oh, you stopped beating your wife this week? Good for you. Super progress. We're so excited. That is a little bit of progress, and that's a step in the right direction, but that's not the type of progress or type of relationship or type of healing that we need to really address domestic violence or abusive cycles, right? And so we really need to admit as a society that we are just doing damage control at this point, and we have so much farther to go when it comes to actually inclusion and healing and repair. And the church is going to have to really put their shoulder to the wheel to even begin the process of what really would be considered even the beginning of progress in this regard. Does that make sense?
And Natasha, I think this is a really good point for all of us to consider with humility, where our privilege is. I think for so many people who were overjoyed yesterday, and that was the majority of their emotion, that is not an invalid emotion, but there's probably a privilege that showed up in the fact that the policy did not devastate your family, remove a loved one forever, or show up with individuals seeking out to excommunicate you for your committed relationship, right? So I wanted just to say that the joy is not invalid, but it also comes with some privilege that this policy didn't directly devastate you, right? Or take a life, or cause incredible spiritual abuse through excommunication, right? And so I think this is the invitation for all of us in the space of privilege to step back and listen to the LGBTQ Mormon voices, or the families of LGBTQ Mormons, because their emotions right now are a little bit more complex than just joy. And once again, I think that is how do we mourn with those that mourn, which is one of the greatest privileges and also one of the most refining fires in our ability to honor what is.
Tracy Hazler says, as the parent of a gay child, I left the church after 35 years as a member. This reversal cements to me the correctness of my decision. This wasn't about revelation. This was about culture. Lori says, they're grateful for the discussion and vulnerability. And there's a few comments about apology, so I'll go ahead and read those before we move into, again, Jen, I want you to talk about abuse dynamics. I've said that like 4 times now, sorry. We get distracted. But Lori says, wouldn't an apology undermine one of the pillars of the LDS Church, that being deference to authority and the focus on obedience, because leadership is supposedly guided by God? I'm remembering a quote by Dallin Oaks that the church does not apologize. So I think what she's saying is, does an apology mean we have to admit that we weren't really speaking on God's behalf? And then Lori Draper Smith says they could apologize for the ramifications of their policy decisions without claiming the policy itself was wrong. So that's kind of a workaround. Jennifer says, I'm shocked that there are actually Mormons admitting that the POX, which is POX is short for policy of exclusion, was wrong. All I've seen is defensiveness, and that's what angers me the most. So yeah, what do we want to say about maybe some of the challenges in our culture that is very kind of with this idea that God is leading the church, these stewards are only speaking on God's behalf. This kind of goes back to my earlier comment of, well, what can we do? It's God who's doing this. We can't take responsibility because this is how God would have wanted it to go down. We're not theologians, so I don't know if this is an area of our expertise, but any thoughts?
I have some thoughts. There is room for reframes of, our leaders don't have to be perfect, and giving them that room. I would much rather have leaders that are willing to apologize and to admit when they're wrong and kind of step up and do better. And the process of revelation kind of comes through our own biases, and it's an ongoing relationship with God. It may not happen overnight where we get all the answers. That's one great reframe.
So you're saying we could use our own thoughts as Mormons to say, yes, we are tuned into God, but in that process of being tuned into God, we may also make mistakes, which in essence, we've had to do anyway, right? We've had to do that on several issues already in our church history. And we do have talks where we talk about the infallibility of men that serve in these capacities. So it's not like we don't have possible reframes to make this a possibility, is I think what you're saying.
And yet at the same time, I want to create space for a variety of reframes, right? Because I think we had a commenter say that as a mother of a gay son, this was it for her, right? And so another reframe was, this is completely out of alignment with my values and the safety of my child. And that's equally valid, right? And so once again, having people step back into their own conversation about what their revelation is. And this can, once again, be hard, right, within Mormonism. And yet we have the principles and practices to practice it, right? So encouraging clients about what is your understanding of your own personal revelation, and can that be beautiful and meaningful too in the decision making for you and your family, right? And so I love Jen. I think Jen's reframe, because I think many people within the Mormon space, that is a working model. And yet at the same time requires repentance and movement forward and progress and safety.
Yeah,
Lori,
I
think kind of the thing.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think the thing I would like to say, just as a general overarching response, is that I think the question does highlight the fact that there is a need for reframe, that the prevailing cultural and or institutional approach does not create space for humans to make human mistakes and then to apologize and repent and heal those mistakes. And that is an institution and systematic problem that does need reframing. And that, do I know the exact answer for what that reframing might look like, where our values become in line with our spirituality and our spiritual choices? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think Jen presented a possibility, and I think that many exist within what we would call the doctrine of the church, that there's a ton of space for that reframe, but that institutionally and systematically it is necessary.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think this is why it's important to talk about this from that perspective of the abuse cycle, because if we don't reframe this systematically, what ends up happening is the gaslighting, because, not my problem, that's God, right? And then not only that, now you're interfering with divine possibility or spiritual possibility of other people having a relationship with God, because you're imposing your own authority onto them. And third is that it creates this abuse cycle where we just have to be okay with whatever, because God said so, even though it's incredibly harming. The fruits of the tree are rotten and are harming in ways that we can measure very clearly, that have been researched, in the mental health capacity. So Jen, do you want to talk really fast about the abuse cycle?
Yeah. When I work with people that have, committed domestic violence or have a charge for that, it's interesting. It definitely takes a lot for them to kind of own that and to really recognize where they have done harm. And it's easy to I think for people when they maybe make that apology and they start to get maybe in that honeymoon phase where they aren't harming physically their spouse, of like, oh, I deserve all this credit for this, and it's okay for like someone that's been abused not to want to stay in that relationship and need to get out, and there needs to be room for that and understanding. So I think, often it when people really can change and not be abusive, often we see this cycle where they will stop for a while and then they'll go back to it. And so all of our lives are going to look different, whether we work on certain relationships. And I've seen couples get through this and really change, and it's been beautiful. And I've seen other people make the right decision to leave those relationships. So we just need to create spaces there's going to be a lot of different emotions involved, and that making space for them and making space that there isn't one right answer for all of us. And that's going to look different. And that applies, of course, with the church. Not everyone is going to be safe for them to have to be active. And that's okay. And that's valid.
Well, in fact, we really kind of know that we're creating very unsafe places, even for people who perceive it as safe because it's their home, and because, especially youth, that's all they know. They don't have the developmental capacity or the even ability to self-autonomize completely, if their parents are forcing them to go to church or all those things, that these aren't safe places for people, even if they perceive them as safe places, which that's even more complicated, right? Because now you have issues of agency and autonomy, and this even is true of adult members, who choose celibacy and who choose, ways to interact with their faith communities, which is their right and their decision. And we can find ways that they can try to manage that tension. And yet we also know there's severe consequences to a choice of celibacy, a choice of, not having a sexual or romantic or companionship type life, or a mixed orientation marriage. There's severe consequences to those types of choices, even though we respect them and honor them because we understand the cultural framing of why people make those decisions. Very complex. Anybody else want to talk about kind of how understanding cycles of abuse, maybe either from a domestic violence lens or other it's not just domestic violence, but systematic abuse. How did those theories help us understand some of the dynamics that are happening here systemically?
One of the ideas that I think is important to understand is the idea of trauma blindness, because often we have a really hard time understanding family members or friends who go to such great lengths to protect the institution, right? And there's a similar dynamic that happens in abusive relationships where an abused person will go to great lengths to protect their abuser. And it can be, I have seen repeatedly people be incredibly cruel and dismissive of abused individuals. Why did they stay? What is their problem? They're so dumb, right? And yet it's part of our psychology, right? Like we are hardwired to protect almost at all costs our sources of belonging, right? That's a part of being human. And on a subconscious level that we're not even really aware of, our brain makes decisions about what it will see and what it will not see because it's not safe to the relationship in order to see the abuse, right? And it's not people actually making conscious, well-informed choices. It's like much deeper and more visceral than that. Like on a level that before the choice even rises up into our consciousness, the choice has been made that it's not safe for me to see this as abusive, because if I leave this relationship, then I won't have any place where I belong. I won't be able to take care of myself. I won't have anybody who loves me. I won't have a community. I won't have a meaning or a purpose in my life, right? And that's programming that goes super deep. And so I get very twitchy when people are condemning towards abuse victims and saying, why didn't they leave? Why couldn't they see it? Why did they allow that person to treat them that way, right? As though any of us would be capable of seeing it differently if we were in the same circumstances, because we wouldn't. I mean, that's just how our brains work. We all react the same way. And some of the smartest, most amazing, strong women I know have been in abusive relationships. And it's incredibly painful for them to hear the way that we talk about abuse victims in that way. And I think that recognizing that trauma blindness is a thing, that we do not necessarily see clearly the ways we are being abused. And I think that I did a professional development here in Idaho for therapists who treat Mormon clients, and that was one of their biggest questions was, well, why do they stay, right? Like people who have never been Mormon, therapists who've never been Mormon, they'll often say to their LGBT clients, well, why don't you just leave? Like they just really don't have that depth of understanding of what trauma blindness does and the ways that we are wired to protect our relationships and our belongings.
Well, and I feel like too, like the trauma is on both sides of the equation. So people who are outside the system are like, why in the heck would you stay? People inside the system are saying, what? You're not being abused, right? Mm-hmm. And so either way, you're getting kind of like a non-empathic, non-joining, non-helpful response, right? And either way, you're feeling ostracized by a part of the community that doesn't really get what you're going through. Yeah. And I think that in of itself is part of the abusive pattern, is that the abuser doesn't, to Jen's point, it's very hard to say, oh yeah, I'm an abuser, to take accountability for that. And so within the family system or the community system, it's very easy to say that the abuse isn't even happening. I don't think that really, the church or church members are saying this was abusive to begin with. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what's missing from the conversation and why so many people are having such a hard time even celebrating this to begin with. And that's part of the abuse cycle, is that people who abuse are usually in power, are charismatic, are, have a lot of, energy and resources. The victim has a lot less of that. And when they speak up, they're silenced, they're silenced by the family or the system that says, no, this can't be happening. We're good people. This person's a good person, that they would never do anything like that. We would never do that as a community. And I think Mormons, this is a part of it, is our huge identity is that we're good people. We're wonderful people. We're service-oriented people. We're not abusers. So when the LGBT community is coming and saying, hey, this is abusive, or when mental health professionals like us are saying, hey, this is abusive, it cuts right at the core of the Mormon identity, which is that we're good, loving, service-oriented, God-following, Christ-like people. It's going to take a lot of humble pie to get beyond that.
I think, Natasha, one of the most poignant examples that I saw within my practice and personally was when the November 5th policy came out the first time. There was this huge narrative of, this is such a loving choice for the children of individuals in same-sex marriages. I saw that narrative consistently. Instead of hearing the voices of same-sex couples who had children that they would like to be included in the church because it's their family, their tribe, and the church and spiritual language that they're attuned to, say, this does not feel kind. This does not feel loving. Right? This feels destructive, right? And so once again, that's an abusive cycle. For someone to tell someone else like, nope, this is loving, this is kind. And for someone who it directly impacts to be able to say, my mind, body, spirit is telling every part of me that this is not okay. Right. And so that's a really, really great example of what Jen was saying, like, and the gaslighting, like, this is the narrative of how you should feel. Instead of listening to the really diverse reactions of how it felt. And even going systematically deeper, there is nothing loving about keeping children from being a part of the family systems that they belong to. And I know a lot of the narrative was, so they don't hear I mean, the concept of having to, and keep me really honest, you guys, about this, the concept that you'd have to disavow your parents' marriage, right? What about that is in alignment with loving, right? And so once again, this is the cognitive dissonance, this is the mental gymnastics, this is the cognitive and spiritual abuse that showed up when a community has a narrative to justify something that without question is hurting other people. It's abusive.
Classic, yeah, it's the classic I know best for you. And how many times do you hear kind of that narrative from abusive parents? It's like, this hurts me more than it hurts you, as they're putting welts on their child's body, right? Or I know I'm only doing this for your own good, even though that's questionable. So it's a very harmful approach. And again, it kind of comes back to this idea that we really have to challenge, if we're going to see doctrine as more important than relationships. First of all, why would doctrine be opposed to relationships? That's a question I think people need to ask themselves. And second of all, if relational harm is being chosen over challenging of doctrine, I think that's another thing that people really need to be considering. And in a church where we have possibility for revelatory change, I think we have the ingredients possible. We're not one of those churches where we're like, everything has to stay exactly the same. And we haven't changed, we haven't stayed exactly the same. We have at least some of the ingredients to do a better job of this, I think, within our space between doctrine and relational health and mental health and things that we know now that we didn't know before. When you know better, hopefully you do better. And I'm hoping that we can step into that space.
I also, one of my favorite doctrinal sort of approaches is, relational. If we say that families are forever, and that's sort of the basis of much of our church belief, celestial glory is about connection to the people we love, then it seems like whatever creates good relationships would be celestial.
Yes.
And that should be doctrine. That's my opinion.
Right.
Yes.
Like if we create good relationships that people want to be a part of, if we create forever families because that's one of the things I hear all the time from people leaving the church is like, I don't want to be connected to those people forever. Well, then we're doing something wrong. Like if we're not creating families people want to be a part of forever, then we have not created a celestial doctrine.
And if you really believe that, families can be together forever and that families are so important, then that relationship's important, and putting energy and work to understand where all your family members are coming from. And instead of this, there's just one right way, and harming and not seeing that harm in the relationships. Yeah. There's so much more energy that we have this rich doctrine that really could help us focus on our relationships that I wish we would use more.
As well as coupling our doctrine with evidence-based practices, right? Yes. I know as clinicians, we're like, can we use the data? Can we use the research? And when you think about it from a family acceptance project, and I'll make sure, Natasha already linked it. I want to just talk about a few resources that as clinicians and as a community, guys, we need to be better up to date on our biology information, on our trauma-informed care information, right? But what we know from the research is this: family acceptance, kindness, compassion. We love you regardless of what you choose to do with your sexual and or gender identity. Reduces depression. It reduces anxiety. It reduces distress and suicidal ideation. Family acceptance is research-based in creating saving lives, right? And that should be incorporated in any doctrine regarding a family, right? So that is so important. I think another big research where I learned a great deal, I'm not someone who studied deeply in biology, is Greg Prince's new book. He provided, and I'll include the link on the bottom of this, a video presentation at the University of Utah where he discusses the evolution of biology regarding homosexuality, right? Like the church, and this is hard to hear, right? But the church is in a losing battle in its understanding of homosexuality from a biological perspective. And I think all Mormon clinicians, if you're working with Mormon populations, we are ethically required to be up to date in both the research on sexuality and gender identity, because that is a part of our ethical practice. And as hard as that is, it can be oftentimes conflict with our religious ideals.
I love all of this. Let me say just a few of the questions.
Maybe we are theologians.
Maybe we are.
I can't get to all the comments, but some of them. Lori Haymore says, abuse doesn't require conscious complicity. And yes, good and loving folks can participate in perpetuating abuse. This is so true. It's not, sometimes we see the dichotomy, you're either bad or you're good, or evil. You're either evil or you're loving. No, we can act in very detrimental, harmful ways, even with good intentions, with, identifying ourselves as loving people. That is so true. Lori Draper Smith says the policy had nothing to do with protecting children of LGBTQ people, but everything about controlling the church narrative. And I think that she's speaking to this confirmation bias. Sometimes we come up with explanations that, help us feel good about ourselves. And really we need to, again, eat some humble pie and not do that. One thing that Lori says, she says, challenging policy is different than challenging doctrine. Policy changes constantly. And I agree with that. I think one of the main issues that we have really facing the church today, and it's kind of what Sara is alluding to, is that I do think that most people in the church would see same-sex marriage and, like heterosexual marriage as a doctrinal issue. And the church has said so as well. And the reality that we're really facing in this church that not a lot of people want to talk about in these spaces of making little steps of progress, that really, until we are inclusive to the point that same-sex marriage is doctrinally supported, we're really not going to make the progress that we need to make to really address the issues of mental health, relational health, emotional health of our LGBTQ members. And research backs that up 100% of the way. Both, and this also goes for gender identity issues as well, right? Which is different than sexual orientation, which is oftentimes completely missed in this whole conversation. And many in the LGBTQ community have told us that we are missing the boat on really talking about transgender and gender identity issues as separate from this whole conversation. So how you identify as gender and how you identify and who you're attracted to and want to have a romantic or sexual relationship with, those are all huge things that right now our doctrine does not make space for health in those departments. And we have to face that. And just putting the blame on God and saying, sorry, this is what God said about this, is part of the abuse pattern. And until our church leaders deal with that directly, we will not be in a space of progress. We may be in a space of politically moving slightly, like when I have to celebrate something like transgression is better than sin in language, that's pathetic celebration. That's pathetic celebration of mine. Any thoughts on this doctrinal issue? And then we'll talk about General Conference.
I think we need a name, once again, for the clinicians listening, the divide, right? That so much of the LGBTQ IA+ research and evidence-based practices can conflict with religious doctrine, right? And I think if we're really humble and honest as clinicians, that can cause discomfort within ourselves. Right. And that talks what Jen said about the soul searching that shows up, and yet making sure that we have support and continued education, and which we all do, continuing education credits every year. Like if you feel like you're at a deficit in understanding the latest research, there's so many incredible resources out there. And so making sure that we are all collectively supporting each other and getting up to date. And also practicing the same thing, sitting with our clients. I can't tell you how many clients and parents I have sat with that have looked at their LGBTQ child and they say, they're perfect. I love them so much. There's nothing wrong with them. And yet that challenge with the narrative they were raised regarding homosexuality, just being gay, let alone without acting as a sin, right? So, I mean, what you're feeling internally as a clinician, I want you to recognize that that's what's showing up in your clients too, right? There can be a lot of empathy and love and compassion, and it's sitting with both, like Natasha said. Like, it is the compassion of, I can love in this church, and my authentic wisdom as a parent of a gay child, or as a clinician, is at a standstill. And how do I wrestle with that? And I think that's why so many of our opinions are so uncomfortable and really push people into thinking, because it opens up the honesty of that divide. And we need to do better, because if not, we're losing lives.
And I want to be very honest that if I would have listened to myself 10 years ago, I would have been very defensive to my own ideas that I have right now. So I understand that this is a process for all of us. We can't know what we don't know, and we have to get through that hurdle of confirmation bias. And all of that is very difficult. And I've been through that process myself. And I'm sure I still have a long way to go in that process yet. I'm sure 10 years from now, I will have different ideas that I would not hold to be even worthy of thought at this particular point in my life.
There's space for evolution here, and we need to meet it.
And I think that is where doctrinally the Mormon Church does have a lot of space, because even though we do put a lot of emphasis on obedience, we do have a strong doctrine of agency and personal revelation. And those do have an inherent paradox. And there's more paradoxes than that, right? Like, our doctrine is chock full of paradox. And one of the things that I found personally comforting was the idea that the paradox and the discomfort is where I'm supposed to be, right? Like, we do have a cultural narrative that we're supposed to know what's right, and we're supposed to be very comfortable and defensive of that rightness. And switching that particular paradigm to a paradigm where being in the midst of paradox and being in the midst of struggle and being very uncomfortable was actually where I was supposed to be, because that was the place of learning and curiosity and struggle.
Stacy talks about this dilemma, Stacy Gibbons. It's ridiculous that the rhetoric from church leaders is, we need to love the LGBT people. You are kidding yourself in saying that you are loving people when your doctrines are so exclusionary. So it talks about this. She's really addressing the cyclical thing that we're talking about, where people who are, the perpetrators of abuse oftentimes don't see it that way, think that they're being loving, when in reality they're just participating in an abusive cycle, and why it's not working. I don't think you talk to many, if you talk to non-gay people in the church, they will tell you that we are loving towards gay people. If you talk to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender and queer people in the church, or people who've left, very few people have told me that they feel love or inclusion in our society. And if they're still active, they're there in spite of not feeling those things, because they do have profound belief systems or attachment to their faith, journey within the Mormon construct. So it's in spite of not feeling included and loved. That's a real problem that we have to face. Lindsay Hansen Park says, I love these people. Thank you. I love you too. And I'll read a comment from Thomas Montgomery. He's a Papa Dragon. He's a dad too. He's very public, so I feel like I can say that. I think a lot of people know who he is. He says, the exclusion policy was a copy and paste of a policy against polygamy in the church. It is destined to fail, as polygamy and homosexuality have nothing to do with each other. And it exposed how out of touch church leaders were to think that this was a one-size-fits-all fixed marriages we don't like or support. So yes, he's talking about some of the systemic issues there and how we've dealt with issues in the past, and history tends to repeat itself. And that's true of all communities. So we need to watch that as well. All right. Oh, and Lori Haymore says, I saw a poster that said, the magic happens between the trapezes. Am I saying that right? Right in the middle of paradox. So that's kind of a beautiful thought, that even though paradox is hard and we wrestle and it's difficult and we struggle and we get defensive, it is oftentimes where beauty and growth abide. And that's actually very Mormon doctrinal. It's in the trials that we learn and we grow, and that's what we're here to experience. So that, from a Mormon story, that's actually very, it fits. All right, let's move on then, because I know we could be talking forever, and I know you all have to do things other than this today. But we are concerned that, like you said, Sarah, at the beginning, what many people don't understand in the general population is that General Conference is usually a time we make more money. That's maybe a weird way to say that. And
it's all about the money.
Yeah, I say that tongue in cheek because although I like making money and I like having a successful practice to help with mental health, I don't particularly like that this is a pattern that we see in mental health clinics. And we are not the only ones that have talked about this. As most of us, I think, all of us are members of the Mormon Mental Health Association. And as we've talked to other providers that serve this population, this tends to be a trend. I'm not sure if there's data to support it yet or research, so I will not necessarily comment on that, but it seems to be anecdotally something that we notice, that we're busier the week or two after General Conference, and that people are coming in, physically telling us that's the reason why they're there. So I heard this, I saw this, my parents sent me this, I listened to this, what does this mean? And so we thought we would share just some of our own thoughts or perspectives on how we can prepare for, because we already have now a big thing that's happened. A lot of people are reeling, a lot of people are struggling, a lot of people are confused as to how to feel about this. And now we're going to add 2 more days of messages, and we don't know if they're going to address this particular issue further or not. I'm guessing not. That would be my guess, that they'll kind of sweep this under the rug, but they may address it in more indirect ways, like we've seen it addressed just recently. So it's just talking about traditional families, talking about traditional gender roles, talking about obedience and the importance of revelation. They may talk about how we, should follow church leaders, and that's what you need to trust over almost anything else. These are the ways that indirectly they may be, focusing on focusing on topics that are also affected by this particular issue. So I'm just going to open up for thoughts and processes on this.
One of the things I think, and I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's so important, especially this weekend, to make space for different emotions. And let's not label it if someone's crying and feels hurt over a talk. Let's not label that as evil. Let's really try to have empathy, because that our emotions are valid. There is a reason we are feeling what we're feeling. And let's really make room to understand that and focus on that relationship rather than condemning their emotion.
So you're talking about people who might be witnessing other people's reactions and how to sit with instead of preach at or try to excuse or minimize how they're presenting.
Yeah. And I would include, some people are going to be angry about talks, and that's okay. We all have that process. It's not evil to be angry. It's not, emotions aren't good or bad, as far as or righteous or evil, but making room for that.
Sorry, but I just want to make this point, and then I'll let Sarah. So having just gone to a suicide prevention training, it was really interesting to see the things that don't work in helping people feel less suicidal. For example, cheerleading. Oh, you have so much to live for. Oh, you don't have to feel that way. Oh, so in other words, kind of trying to get people to feel a different way. What's scary is to really sit with the feeling that is there. And if you can do that, that is actually much more likely to keep people grounded, even if they're in a space where they want to die or feeling angry. If you can just sit there and just say, okay, so you're wanting to die, tell me about that, right? Or, okay, you're angry, tell me about that, instead of trying to convince them that they shouldn't feel that way. So I just want to piggyback, because I think that really gives a second witness to what Jen was saying. Sarah, go ahead.
I think building off of that, Natasha, is focusing on connection. So many of us as clinicians kind of have to come up with a game plan or a safety plan for clients surrounding General Conference time. I don't think the general Mormon public would realize that. And at the same time, I want everyone to have full permission to do what is right for them. So if that is not participating or not listening or disengaging or turning off your social media, like once again, both as a clinician and for clients, thinking through your wellness matters here. And once again, going back to that connection model, so often where I think the pain shows up is where we're looking to connect with our primal family members who may be active and believing, and they're not able to meet us, right, in that pain. Like they might not be where Jen said, where they could express rage or express some real sadness of what's coming over the pulpit and be met with kindness and compassion from their family member. So for any of those listening, thinking about 2 to 3 people that can be your safety person, right, that you could call and say, like, if you choose to listen, or if you know that you'll be exposed to things that could be triggering, who can you call and say, like, this was really hard for me, right? And that they can hold it with safety, with kindness and compassion. Because once again, what Natasha said, that connection, that ability just to feel safely heard is one of the greatest ways to reduce that suicidal ideation or any thoughts of deep despair. So think about who in your pocket, and if you're a provider here or a provider listening, like, who are your people that you can talk about what it means for you to we laughed today, but like gird up your loins for general conference for your clients, right? Like, who can you have that support with if that's your own therapist or your own network? Because once again, your wellness matters too.
I was thinking I might speak to people who are maybe not ready yet. And I don't know if any of them would be listening to this podcast, but maybe you're in a position where you're going to be stuck at home with your family and everyone's going to be watching conference. And if you don't, it'll be a big deal and you're not ready for that yet, right? Like, so what are some ways that you can deal with sort of like sitting down and watching something that you know might have a big emotional effect on you, and you don't feel ready yet to share with your family that this is hurting you? And there are some, and like, I want to emphasize again Sarah's point that I would hope that you would be able to do whatever you need to do, and maybe just say, I can't. But if you can't do that, if you don't feel ready to do that yet, there are some emotional tricks that you can, do, as far as like thinking about conference as, something that you're coming in as an anthropologist to study, right? Like putting on your anthropologist hat and taking off your like wounded self hat, because your wounded self is not going to be the one that's going to be able to cope with what's going to be coming at you at that time. And maybe after conference is over, you can go find those people that you can share your wounded self with. But if it's not safe to do that with your family right now, put on your anthropologist hat. Another one that can be interesting is to play like general conference bingo or general conference predictions, right? Where you can actually kind of get a little bit of an emotional high from predicting terrible things that people might say and then being right. And even though that sounds kind of mean, if it can create a space where you can get through it to a place where you can heal and get that, that healing done, I'm going to say go for it. Like whatever you need to do in order to get through until you're ready to share with your family the changes that you have experienced.
I love those tips. And one that I would add is, I call it the translation machine. So you stick in something like, oh, the traditional, every time you hear traditional family, you translate that to mean something you want to have it mean. So families of all colors and places, or something. So you just kind of like insert your own translation so that you can kind of self-protect in that way too. So I like all of the suggestions of boundaries, community support. If you're going to participate, have internal boundaries. I think that's what Lisa's really talking about, is internal ways to kind of place stop signs where they need to be placed. So that's good. A few more comments. So Dr. Randy Moss, again, another member of the MMHA, he says, as a mental health professional, mine is not to exact repentance from church leaders, but concentrate on mitigating negative responses and lovingly walk with the hurting, confused, and angry. I spend much less energy tilting at the church windmill and the damaging policy. I don't engage the true believing Mormon with confirmation bias. Mine is the calling to lift the hands that hang low, slack the thirst of the parched. So that's him talking about, his own personal approach as a mental health, provider to how he manages some of that. So appreciate your thoughts there. I wanted to say, let's see here. Lori says, completely understandable that more people seek help after General Conference weekend. Lori Draper-Smith says, when I worked on the Provo crisis line, our phones rang off the hook during and after conference. So that's somebody who, again, has anecdotal evidence. And Stacy Gibbons says, smiley laugh, do what you have to do to cope. So I think that's a good mantra. We definitely deserve to cope. We deserve to live. We deserve to have joy in our lives. We deserve relationships. We deserve relationships where we are seen and heard and understood. For those in the LGBTQ plus community, they are deserving of romance, of sex, of a lifestyle, of family building, if that's what they choose to do, of marriage, of all the things that all of us hope and want to do, if that's our choice, if that's where we lean to. They are deserving of those things. And we need to wrestle with that on a much deeper level as a Mormon community. Any final thoughts from all of you? Maybe I'll go around and force you to have final thoughts. How about that? This time I'll start with Lisa, then Jen, and end with Sara.
Let's see, final thoughts. I think just normalizing that it's absolutely 100% okay to feel what you feel right now. Like when the first policy was announced, my response was something along the order of what I felt when my father died. Like it was very similar emotionally. And I remember telling some people that, and they really invalidated that. They're like, this is nothing like your father dying. I'm like, but it feels like that, And this time I'm actually feeling kind of numb, and I'm a little bit afraid that it's going to hit hard in a couple more days. I don't know. But right now I'm not feeling a whole lot. And that may be a coping mechanism. And I think but just allowing yourself to feel what you feel and not feel what you don't feel, right? One of my favorite grief specialists says that the only way to grieve incorrectly is to thinking you're doing it incorrectly. So that would be my takeaway, is allow yourself to feel what you feel and find communities and people to, because my tendency is to isolate, and I know that's not good for me. And so if you know what your bad tendencies are, maybe mindfully try and get some outdoor time, go for some walks, sit with some friends, do the things that we all know what they are. We all know the list of self-care things that are good for us, but mindfully make some space for yourself in this next week and to do those things.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. Jen, what are your final thoughts?
God, I loved what Lisa said. Definitely making space if you can. And if it's hard to watch General Conference, but giving yourself permission to turn it off if you're able to. And definitely, please reach out if you're struggling. And call and make those connections. I know sometimes it's the hardest when you're feeling depressed or overwhelmed to reach out. I know that's when I struggle to reach out. And so also, if you know people that are struggling or that might have different reactions to General Conference, to take that responsibility to check in with them and how they're doing. I think that's so important in our connections and really putting our relationships first in our lives.
Thank you, Jen. Sara.
Thanks, Jen. I think I'm going to tailor my thoughts to providers. Any of those listening, just as well as I think just so much love and compassion to all of those who have been influenced, providers, family, our LGBTQIA+ community. Just the reality that I want you to know you're heard, that you're seen, that what we have witnessed is irreversible damage. And I think naming it out loud is incredibly important. And just for all listeners to be able to consider what boundaries are right for you in the next few weeks. What we know about trauma is that when it hits and when it shows up, it can be vicarious or re-exposure of abuse, which I think for many people, the reversal of the policy feels like a re-exposure of that level of abuse, that for the next 3 weeks, systematically, your central nervous system is going to need some more gentle kindness and attention. Because what many of us go through is a step back into hypervigilance. There's a reality that I am not safe here. And I think we saw that with some of the comments about a lack of apology, like I'm still not safe here. And so just that gentle reminder to both mourn with those that mourn and take really good care of yourselves. Like if those providers listening, like we need you. We need you and we need each other. And as supporters of this community, making sure we're sitting and listening to the voices of our clients and those that are really struggling.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think my final thoughts might be actually towards, the top 15, because I guess I see them as the person holding the club. And I do want to say thank you for putting down the club. I do think that's important. We could have gone another 40 years or 30 years or 10 years with this policy not reversed. So I do want to say thank you for that. I think many of us told you that this was not good and we had hoped to see it reverse much earlier. But the fact that it took 3.5 years in Mormon land is not very common. So I do want to say thank you for that. I want to say that my saying thank you for that does not mean that I'm super proud or excited about how you've been acting and how you continue to act. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think you're still harming people. So I want to give credit where credit is due. I think that's important. And at the same time, there's still damage here. And it takes more than putting down the club to stop being an abuser. And I'm hopeful that you know that we love you and that we support you and I sustain you. This is my way of doing that. I don't think that we do anybody any favors by enabling abuse in our ability to love and sustain. So my holding you very directly accountable is my way of saying we can do better. We know we can. I think we have very similar values, very similar goals, and we need to do better at making sure that people's lives are not facing the type of roller coaster rides they've been on these last 3.5 years, rides that oftentimes have been fatal and have caused much damage that then many of us are left picking up the pieces from. And that's not fair and it's not okay. So thank you, and a lot after that thank you. The thank you is a very minimal part of this. So those are my final thoughts. I again want to thank all of those who are in the trenches with people like us. I want to give my love to all of those who have suffered in ways that I will never understand, even though I sit with you. I want to, just hopefully be a source of the progress and healing that we as a community need to do. And I'm so grateful for all of you because you very much edify that part of me and you're part of that journey with me. All of you here, in this panel, but all of you also who are listening and who do that in ways that maybe our paths will never physically cross, but we are all in this together. So thank you for that. With that, I will say, please help with this podcast, keep it alive, help get our messages to other people, help support us financially if that's something that you're able to do. And please be an advocate for mental and relational health in your own life and in the lives of others. It's so important. It's such a big part of living, I think, in ways that, in my view, Heavenly Parents would want us to be able to experience. And I feel like saying in the name of Jesus Christ, amen, but I won't say that. Is it okay if I said
you
it?
did just say that, Natasha.
You did just say that. Thank you, everyone.
All right, everybody. Have a great weekend. Look for spiritual things that you can agree on. Especially
take good care of you.
Yeah, take good care of you. If you're in a mixed faith relationship, take care of each other. Give spaces to each of you. We love you. We support you. Have a good one. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous shoal. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will. When thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear